making that how we walk through the world. And then for me, am I a collection of particles, which is what I used to think in my cosmic nihilist perspective, or am I a sacred spiritual being? And that's my choice that I get to make as a sovereign being. So this is just a history of the narrowing of consciousness based on the emergence of humans based in fear. So for 4,000 years and longer, we've been displacing each other. So those with high sense of fear, needing to hoard and control, which is fear-based responses to life, have been displacing people from land who just wanted to live peaceably with Mother Nature, the Great Mother, or their land, the historical ancestral lands. And so that displacement has been going on for a long time as we've consolidated into more and more centralized cities. From there, then the war on consciousness saw the Catholic Church and other leaders taking away the entheogenic experience in ceremony and narrowing consciousness so we become better cogs in the wheel, better resources to feed the machine. And then in the 500 years ago, we saw then the war on melanin begin, which was another response of expanding into different parts of the world and controlling people, land, resources, and in order to control and tell a narrative that people can live with, because we all have spirit in us. So how do we deal with the darkness? We tell a story where we other people. And melanin is an easy way to other people because it's very visible, obviously, and this was the narrative that was told throughout the world, that people with high melanin are not as good as or as valuable as people with lower melanin. Then began war on, so that went on for 400 years, war on fundamental freedoms, and then the war on civil rights, which we still continue to see now, eroding voter rights, trying to control and diminish the power of, in this country, people of different experiences than the majority experience. Then we saw the war on drugs emerge, war on immigrants, war on drugs, and most recently is the great paradigm wars, which I believe is what we're in now because we have a global information system, and there are those who have figured out, who have deep pockets and a lot of resources and have mastered for many, many decades the ability to control information. So if you can place fear and use fear to manipulate, and you can get data from people on their movements in a large collective whole, now you can start to sort of orchestrate how people move in the world and control their behaviors from a place of fear. And so what we see from fear as a driven response is a narrowing of the field of awareness. We see a detachment from interconnectedness. We see a disconnection from the logic of nature. Nature has so much to teach us, but we start to disconnect from nature. And then we start losing our sense of spirit and reverence for life as we become more and more disconnected from each other. What we do know about entheogens is that they expand awareness, they create greater interconnectedness with nature and each other, and it allows us a greater understanding of the lessons of nature if we then become more aware of our surroundings, and then finally it gives us a sense of reverence for life. So it's a direct counter-response to the last thousands of years in which fear has become a deeper part of the human experience. It's almost as if nature loves us and wants us to heal. So yes, this gets back to the message part. So this is a bit of a case study. This is my own case study. Life as a prisoner trapped in the trauma loop. So I grew up in a Chicano community, Mexican immigrant community. For myself, scarcity was everywhere, and so was violence, so was alcoholism. Many cousins died and brothers died or went to prison because of the war on drugs. But also, predating the war on drugs, just scarcity, violent response to not having enough. So this was my experience. The voices were what I'd said earlier. I'm not good enough. Here I was walking the halls of Yale, thinking, when are they going to discover I don't deserve to be here? Despite the fact I had very good grades, same thing at UCLA. And so that trauma loop was ever present in my life until my mushroom experience, and it took a lot of energy to just stay above it. Every day working out, every day running, just to keep the demons at bay. And then on October 18th, my mother passed, and she was the rock in our life. This was the beginning of the erosion of the entire extended family, whom she held together. And this sent me into a sense of cosmic nihilism where I thought nothing matters. We're all just here to experience suffering, so why be here? And despite the fact I had 3 children, beautiful wife, beautiful family, I felt nothing. I was empty. And so I pursued healing, and I started first with yoga. I'd never done yoga. Coming from a Chicano Mexican family, the idea of doing yoga was absurd. But I needed to heal. I had hope, small bit of hope. And so I hired someone to teach me how to do yoga behind closed doors so that I didn't have to have voices in my head telling me how feminine I looked. And in doing yoga and in doing Shavasana, I discovered consciousness. That moment when you realize that you're not a reaction to everything, but that you are observing the observer. And it was in that moment that I said, what is this thing, consciousness? And there began my path of meditation. So I went into deep subtraction meditation, which is where you throw away everything that isn't you, which is pretty much everything, right? And then I went into deep particle physics studies, wanted to understand what is at the deepest levels of our science, and both of them led me to the same place, which is the void. There's nothing. And so that was the state that I had spoken earlier of about the cosmic nihilism, and thought, despite all of my research in physics, despite my Zen meditation and all my work, I end up here in this path of nothingness. Well, then I had this experience on October 20th, 2018. In my community, mushrooms, ayahuasca, all of these psychedelic drugs were the same as PCP, heroin. It's the stuff you went to prison for. It's the stuff that killed you. There was no mention in my community about these being healing. So when I had my first experience with mushrooms, I called a cousin after reading Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. And I said, "What, mushrooms? What, they heal?" So I called a cousin and I said, "Hey, can you score some mushrooms for me?" And he did. So I went in with a 5-gram journey. I closed the door behind me and I said, "Fuck it, I got to figure out how to heal this." So I went in, closed the door, and boom, connected with the infinite, spoke with spirit, had an incredible conversation, and one of the most important things it taught me is that I was addicted to fear. Creating my own experiences of fear in the world. It's what I was comfortable with. It's all I ever knew. So if things were calm, I was anxious. So I had to create scenarios to create that anxiety and adrenaline. And then as I learned that and started to see pathways out of it, I did the work. And so I am still on that path. It's still there. The demons are still there. I put them in the cage. But sometimes they escape and I just do the work. But in doing the work, it enables me to see around me just how prevalent fear is in humanity. So many other lessons came through, and epiphanies were abundant for the next month, constant epiphanies, connecting things that I never knew were connected. So now we get to this. So now I had this experience where I'm in awe of entheogens, mushrooms in this case, and then some ayahuasca journeys and DMT. Now what? My first experience was awe. After the awe wore off, it was anger, pissed off. Why did no one tell my community about this? I've lost people who died early, including my mother, who were stuck in that state of fear. I've lost cousins to death. I've lost cousins to incarceration. So many of them could have healed from these medicines. So why is no one telling us about this stuff? And so then I went out and started looking for community. This is where I met Larry. This is where I met some really beautiful people in the Bay Area who knew about the work. And then we sat, we had a meeting, and we decided that we were going to tell the world and lead a decriminalization movement, starting in Oakland and so on. That's the Decrim Movement. So we decided to create a movement of awakening to take back what was always ours, nature. And on June of 2019, the Oakland City Council passed unanimously to decriminalize all entheogens from Schedule 1 and to make it lowest enforcement priority, but also to defund enforcement, which was important. It was important to get a unanimous vote, and we did. What's really fascinating about this experience, and it's still the experience we're on, is it's like a tidal wave. It's not in our control. We simply said, let's do it, and then things just started falling into place. Within 4 months of deciding to decriminalize entheogens in Oakland, we were in front of Public Safety Committee, and then a month later we were in front of city council, and it just happened. Soon after that, we started getting calls from all over the U.S. Telling us that they wanted to decriminalize, that other cities wanted to decriminalize, and it's just been exploding ever since. And here we are talking at the Consciousness Live Expo. Okay, so who we are fundamentally at our core is love, and we say that unabashedly because the opposite side of love is fear. So we push the things that come from love: compassion, justice, generosity, community, cooperation, service. And these are our ethos. And so as we push into the world, we recognize that sometimes we're not viewed particularly warmly because oftentimes we're a mirror to people who are living from a place of fear. And we try to be delicate about it, but we're not particularly interested in being delicate with corporations who are there to exploit these and stop our own ability to access these. So we've taken on some corporate interests unabashedly, and we think that we're holding our own. So we're about nature. We exist. I'll put my glasses on. We exist for the decriminalization of our unalienable rights to access entheogenic plants and fungi, which were created by nature. Which were created by nature and evolved for us by our ancestors in partnership with nature to provide us a portal to reconnect. So if we consider that humans evolved corn, humans evolved in cooperation, all of our domestic plants. If we look around and we walk around our cities, we see all of these plants that are edible that we don't even recognize, all of these medicine plants that are around us that we don't even recognize anymore because of how far we've come from nature. But in the process of evolving and building these relationships, we're now surrounded by these plants that are our allies, as food, as nutrition, as medicines, as entheogenic medicines. And so we're just rebuilding those connections and honoring the walk of our ancestors. We're also about consciousness justice, basic concept. Everybody, regardless of race, religion, identification, how they identify, has a right to heal their consciousness and grow. And this is fundamental to who we are, because when we make policies, we're always considering who's the most vulnerable person in this policy arena. If it's a city, who are the most vulnerable populations, and our policies have to support them, or we don't do it. Because if we start passing policies which are for people who are more privileged first, then it means that that becomes the dominant paradigm, and we leave out people who otherwise wouldn't have access, which I'll get to shortly. See, we also honor the indigenous wisdoms, and this is no small thing. These are the folks around the world who have been keeping these medicines, stewarding these medicines, and learning how to work with them. And these folks understand the concept that Larry's going to share later, which is meaning making. That you go into this world of expanded awareness, interdimensionality, and these are folks who've learned how to maneuver in that space. Recently I was talking to a friend, and I said, who's a very experienced medicine person, and I said, I'm stuck in cosmic loneliness. I don't know if anybody here has been in cosmic loneliness, but it's that place where you realize Source is very lonely when in its initial creation. You get stuck. And right out of the gate, he said, oh, try this. Now, I talked to a lot of people, and right out of the gate, he said, try this, and it made sense what he suggested. And so this is the role of the ancient wisdom keepers, as we're going through the spiritual journey for those who want to reconnect with the infinite self. You need guides along the way. It's a lot. And we were talking about people who've been doing this for tens of thousands of years, handing down tradition, that are here to guide us back home, not to get rid of technology, but to learn how to live better with technology. And so these are some wisdom keepers from the Wiharika community. Equitable access, we want to make sure that everyone has access to plant medicines, and that brings us to this slide, which was done by one of our leaders in Colorado. So this is the role of, so the pyramid says most accessibility and then least accessibility. The least people can afford it, for example. So we know that maps, and by the way, we don't oppose anything, and this is a misconception of our movement. We advocate for this, and we're protective of it. So we say decriminalize first, so that we can allow the most people, particularly low-income people, marginalized people, indigenous people, people of color around the world, who otherwise wouldn't get access to our healthcare system, particularly our mental health care system, which is very difficult to get access to, that they may find their way to the abundance of nature. And so we advocate here. We recognize that there are other models that are less accessible, And what we ask them to do is just support our movement as you do your movement, so we can heal everybody. So that's us here. Maps up here. Go maps, but also first decrim, please. This is our model for abundance: grow, gather, gift. We want people to grow their own, so we don't deplete the rainforest for ayahuasca, so we don't deplete the deserts of peyote. Let's grow our own. We all know how to grow, well, not all, but many of us know how to grow food. No different. Many of us have house plants. Somebody once said, well, but ayahuasca plants, Banisteriopsis caapi and chacruna, won't grow in California. So, well, they'll grow in a nursery. You know those plants that you have hanging in your house? Those don't grow naturally either. Those are rainforest plants that we bring into our home. It's warm and we water them a lot, and that's how we have plants that are not from our climate. So what we're suggesting is that we grow our own plants and reconnect with the plants that are already in our community. For example, star jasmine contains ibogaine, and star jasmine is being cut all over the place for landscaping purposes and being taken to the landscape dump, but it contains a healing compound known as ibogaine, which is increasingly scarce out of West Africa, Gabon, from the Bwiti community. So we have our own medicines. It's just relearning what we've forgotten by becoming, again, reconnected to nature's medicines. So how and where we're growing. So we are open source, and this is a new emergence of a new type of organizing model. In 2007, a group, I believe out of Sweden or Switzerland, created the Pirate Party. And they used this, what's called a swarm model, to organize, which basically is open source, is decentralized, is transparent. And in that way, they took over a number of seats in Parliament. They just shared the information. They weren't trying to control, and they supported leaders who emerged. This is the nature of our movement that emerged independently, so sort of coevolution, independent coevolution of a model that we believe is now probably the model for organizing because of the accessibility of social media to enable us to do this kind of organizing. So in this way, we went from one city in 2019 to over 100 cities within like 4 months. And Larry and I were trying to field these, and some of our other board members. Now they're sort of contracted to about 50 viable cities with good leadership that's keeping things together. And so we spend a lot of time supporting them, but we don't try to tell them how to organize. What we protect is the ethos. Love, compassion, justice, equitable access. We protect those, and we sort of, if they start getting co-opted by corporations, corporate interests, profiteering, we say, hold on, that's not our ethos. And in that way, we've had to sort of yank the name so it doesn't get lost from a couple. But otherwise, most folks who get into this recognize that they're in it for purposes of reverence. So that's who we are. And now we're in 9 countries around the world. We've decriminalized now in 13 cities. The one I left off here is Detroit. So these are all the cities that have done it, including Detroit, and now Michigan. Last week we announced a partnership with Students for Sensible Drug Policy to not just decriminalize entheogens, but also to defelonize and reduce penalties for all substances on Schedule 1. We're also organizing in Colorado an initiative that we've submitted to the state. In California, we're working with leadership to try to clean up SB 519, which is going through the process again. There's some things that were embedded last minute that reduce equitable access and reduce the ability to grow, gather, gift. And so we're working on that in California. And Vermont, we're working with an assembly member there to pass decriminalized nature and also reduction of penalties around drug substance use. So there's 5. We have this vision ratified by the board of how we're going to build a healthy community around entheogen use. Step 1 is decriminalize entheogens. We're doing that. We've done the work there. The second one is to protect sacred ceremony. The most risk healing model for our society is community-based ceremony. And what that entails is people sitting together. This is a very traditional way of healing. If you space. I was privileged in 1993 to be part of an ayahuasca ceremony in the rainforest with a person. The entire community showed up. About 40 people, children, everyone gathered for a healing ceremony. A woman who wanted to partook in, but the space was held by the medicine person. So community ceremony is ancient. It's also successful because you have medicine that's for free, and it's also a great way for people with similar traumas to come together. So veterans who've